The December wind rattled the tall windows of Everwood Estate, sending frost patterns creeping across the glass like skeletal fingers reaching toward warmth. Inside the grand drawing room, chaos masqueraded as festivity. Evergreen garlands draped every surface, red velvet ribbons tangled in servants' hands, and the sharp scent of pine mingled with beeswax and tension. Marguerite R. Harris sat curled in the window seat farthest from the commotion, a leather-bound Latin manuscript balanced on her knees, her ink-stained fingers tracing words that had survived centuries, while she struggled to survive a single social season. At 25, she had become what polite society whispered about in scandalized tones, not merely unmarried, but unmarriageable. Her sin wasn't plainness or poverty, but something far more unforgivable. She possessed a mind that refused to apologize for its existence. The Ashford Christmas ball is only a fortnight away, her mother, Lady Victoria Harris, announced to the room at large, though her pointed glance landed squarely on Marguerite. We simply must ensure proper preparations this year. Proper preparations, Marguerite's sister Celeste echoed, resplendent in a rose silk gown that emphasized everything Marguerite lacked. Practiced charm, calculated femininity, strategic silence. Yes, we wouldn't want a repeat of last year's incident. The word hung in the air like smoke. Marguerite's fingers tightened on the manuscript, but she kept her eyes fixed on the page, willing herself invisible. It was a talent she'd perfected over the years, the art of occupying space while barely existing within it. Still buried in those dusty books, I see, her cousin Penelope remarked, loud enough to carry across the drawing room. She exchanged a knowing look with her sister Arabella. Still unmarried at 25, one does wonder if there's a connection. Perhaps if she'd spent less time reading Cicero and more time reading feminine deportment, Arabella added with a tinkling laugh that set Marguerite's teeth on edge, she might have secured at least one proposal by now. Lady Victoria looked up from the seating chart she'd been annotating, her frown lacking any real conviction. Girls, your cousin has other qualities. Yes, Celeste said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. Qualities that frighten away every eligible man in 3 counties. Really, Marguerite, must you correct Baron Pembridge's quotations at the punch bowl? The poor man was humiliated. The memory of last year's Ashford ball blazed through Marguerite's mind with painful clarity, the Baron's pontificating about Voltaire, his gross misattribution, her automatic correction delivered before her brain could engage her tongue, his fury, her mother's mortification, the whispers that had followed her through every room like a malicious echo. Too clever by half. Who would want such a wife? If you'll excuse me, Marguerite said, rising with as much dignity as she could muster, the manuscript clutched to her chest like armor. I believe I shall retire to the library before dinner. She swept from the room before anyone could respond, her worn morning dress whispering against the Persian carpets. The moment she crossed the threshold into the corridor, she allowed herself a single shuddering breath. How many more years of this could she endure? How many more gatherings where she was the object of pity and poorly concealed mockery? This year, she decided with grim determination, she would feign illness. A convenient headache, perhaps a seasonal cold, anything to avoid another evening of standing against the wall while gentlemen looked through her as if she were made of glass. The library welcomed her like an old friend, floor-to-ceiling shelves laden with leather spines, the musty sweet scent of aging paper, weak December sunlight filtering through diamond-paned windows. This was her sanctuary, the only place at Everwood where she could breathe without apology. She moved to her father's old desk, running her fingers across its scarred surface. Lord Edmund Harris had encouraged her intellect, had taught her Latin and Greek, had praised her essays on social contract theory. 3 years since his death, and she still felt his absence like a missing limb. Her mother saw her education as a curse, now a barrier to marriage, to respectability, to everything a woman should want. But Marguerite had found her own way to make her voice heard. Under the pseudonym M.R. Harrington, she'd published 3 essays in prominent journals, her words influencing discourse, while her true identity remained safely hidden. It was the only power she possessed, the power of a mind that society couldn't silence because they didn't know it belonged to her. She was reaching for her current manuscript when a deep voice spoke from the doorway. "You're trespassing in my sanctuary, Your Grace." Marguerite spun around, her heart lurching. A man stood silhouetted against the corridor's dim light, tall, imposing, holding one of her father's philosophy books with the casual confidence of someone accustomed to possessing whatever he pleased. As he stepped into the library proper, December light illuminated features that made her breath catch, sharp cheekbones that could cut glass, storm-grey eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense, dark hair silvered at the temples, despite his relative youth. His charcoal coat was tailored with such precision it might have been sculpted onto his broad shoulders. "And you," he replied, those unsettling grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, "are the author of the most compelling essay on social contract theory I've read in a decade." The world tilted. Marguerite's manuscript slipped from her nerveless fingers. "I beg your pardon." He closed the distance between them with measured steps, setting her father's book on the desk. She could see now that he'd been making notes in the margins, annotations, in a precise, elegant hand. M.R. Harrington. "A clever disguise, Miss Harris, but not clever enough for someone who's been following your work with considerable interest. I don't know what you're suggesting. Please." He held up one hand, and she noticed ink stains on his fingers that mirrored her own. "I'm not here to expose you. Quite the opposite, in fact." Marguerite's mind raced. She'd been so careful. How had he discovered her secret? And more importantly, who was he? The aristocratic bearing, the expensive tailoring, the casual mention of a grace that suggested, "Forgive my rudeness," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Humberto A. Hinton, Duke of Thornwick. Your uncle was kind enough to extend an invitation for the Christmas season." The Duke of Thornwick. Marguerite's pulse hammered against her ribs. She'd heard the name whispered in London, drawing rooms 31 years old, wealthy beyond comprehension, and resolutely opposed to matrimony. Society called him cold, calculating, a confirmed bachelor who viewed marriage as a trap to be avoided at all costs. "Your Grace," she managed, executing a curtsy that years of training had made automatic despite her spinning thoughts. "I was not aware we were expecting guests." A last-minute arrangement. His gaze swept over her, assessing in a way that was neither unkind nor particularly warm. "Though I confess, meeting you was my primary motivation for accepting the invitation." Before she could formulate a response to that alarming statement, his expression shifted something harder, entering those grey eyes. "I overheard your cousins in the drawing room just now," he said quietly, "their commentary on your unmarried state." Mortification washed over Marguerite in a cold wave. "Your Grace, They're fools," he interrupted, and the contempt in his voice was like a physical force. Intellectual intimidation masquerading as superiority. They mock what they cannot comprehend. No one had ever defended her before. The words settled into her chest, warm and dangerous. He moved toward the door, then paused, glancing back with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Miss Harris, I wonder if you might spare me a moment tomorrow. I have a proposition that may interest us both." Then he was gone, leaving Marguerite standing alone in her sanctuary, heart racing, mind whirling, utterly breathless and completely confused. Hello, dear listener. If this tale of intellectual longing and unexpected connection has captured your attention, I would be deeply grateful for your support, a like, a subscription, anything that helps me continue bringing you stories of love, courage, and the defiance of society's expectations. And if you're so inclined, do tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read every message, and they never fail to bring warmth to my heart. Dawn came cold and crystalline to Everwood, painting the frost-covered gardens in shades of pearl and silver. Marguerite had barely slept, the Duke's words circling her mind like restless birds, a proposition that may interest us both. She'd risen before the household stirred, desperate to avoid her mother's inevitable interrogation about their mysterious guest, and sought refuge in the one place no one would think to look for her at such an ungodly hour. The rose garden in December was a study in dormancy, bare canes reaching toward the pale sky, thorns gleaming with ice, the promise of June blooms buried deep beneath winter's grip. She was contemplating this melancholy beauty when she realized she wasn't alone. The Duke of Thornwick crouched beside a particularly gnarled rose bush, examining its structure with the focused intensity of a natural philosopher conducting an experiment. He'd forsaken his formal coat for a simple wool jacket, and there was something disarmingly human about seeing him in the vulnerable morning light. "Those won't bloom again until spring," Marguerite said, her breath misting in the cold air. He glanced up, those storm-grey eyes sharp despite the early hour. "I'm aware. I'm studying the pruning technique. Your gardener has a remarkable understanding of Rosa Damascena propagation." You study horticulture, Your Grace. I study everything, Miss Harris. He rose, brushing dirt from his hands. Knowledge, I've found, is the only reliable constant in an inconstant world. Something in his tone, a loneliness that mirrored her own, made her bold. Then you'll have read Rousseau's Discourse on Inequality. He argues that civilization itself corrupts man's natural state. A romantic notion, Humberto countered, moving closer, but fundamentally flawed. Rousseau ignores that man's natural state includes the capacity for reason, which necessitates social organization. Yet reason without compassion becomes tyranny, and compassion without reason becomes chaos. They stood facing each other in the frozen garden, intellectual equals sparring with ideas instead of swords, and Marguerite felt more alive than she had in years. This was what she'd been starving for, someone who could match her thought for thought, who didn't flinch from her intelligence but welcomed it. I've read all 3 of your published essays, Humberto said abruptly. The one on property rights was particularly incisive, though I disagree with your conclusion about collective ownership. Her pulse quickened. You couldn't possibly. M.R. Harrington. He smiled, and it transformed his austere features into something dangerously attractive. Your arguments have a distinctive structure, Miss Harris. Once I recognized the pattern, confirming my suspicion was elementary. And the proposition you mentioned? She forced the words past the tightness in her throat. Does it involve exposing my secret? Quite the opposite. His expression sobered. I need you to act as my fiancée at the Ashford Christmas ball. Marguerite stared at him. I beg your pardon. A temporary arrangement, 2 weeks of convincing performance, then we part ways. He began pacing the garden path, his movements tightly controlled. I'm being pressured to marry, Miss Harris. Relentlessly. My mother threatens to select a bride herself if I don't act soon. Every social event has become an ambush of marriage-minded families, and worse, my prolonged bachelorhood has spawned vicious rumors about my character, my preferences, my very nature. And you think a fake engagement will solve this? I think appearing settled will give me breathing room, proof I'm capable of commitment. He turned to face her fully. Meanwhile, you've been dismissed by society as unmarriageable, too clever, too challenging, too fundamentally yourself. One evening on my arm at the Ashford ball would prove every person who dismissed you catastrophically wrong. The offer hung between them like something tangible, social vindication, her family finally seeing her as valuable, the delicious satisfaction of watching her cousins' shocked faces. What are your conditions? She asked carefully. His storm-grey eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath. Only one condition, but it's non-negotiable. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the darker flecks in his irises. We must maintain absolute emotional distance, no feelings, no sentiment, no romantic delusions. This is a practical arrangement between 2 rational people who understand the rules of the game. I see. Do you? His voice dropped lower. We play our parts convincingly at the ball, then part ways with our dignity and freedom intact. No complications, no entanglements. We give society what it wants, the appearance of conformity, while we both retain what we value most. Marguerite's heart was thundering now, and she wondered if he could hear it. And your one tenet? Don't fall in love, Miss Harris. The words were spoken with such cold precision they might have been carved from ice. That is my one condition. Can you agree to it? She should say no. Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that standing this close to him already made her pulse race in ways that had nothing to do with intellectual stimulation. But the thought of walking into the Ashford ball on the Duke of Thornwick's arm, of seeing recognition replace dismissal in society's eyes. I agree to your terms, Your Grace. She extended her hand, businesslike, formal. He took it, his grip warm despite the December cold. Then we have an accord. As they walked back toward the house, morning light beginning to chase away the shadows, Humberto said casually, We should spend time together over the next fortnight. Make it convincing. Marguerite nodded, but her mind was already racing. 2 weeks in close quarters with a man whose mere presence made her forget to breathe. 2 weeks of pretending not to feel what she was already beginning to feel. His one tenet echoed in her mind with each step. Don't fall in love. She'd agreed to the impossible, and they both knew it. The morning after their agreement dawned clear and bitterly cold, the kind of December day where every breath turned to mist and the world seemed suspended between seasons. Marguerite found Humberto waiting by the garden gate as arranged, looking impossibly elegant in a dark greatcoat that emphasized his broad shoulders. Shall we? He offered his arm with practiced courtesy, but something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty perhaps, or anticipation. They walked the frosted grounds of Everwood in silence at first, their footsteps crunching against ice-glazed grass. Then Humberto asked, "Your essay on property distribution, who influenced that thinking? The arguments bear traces of Locke, but the conclusions are distinctly your own." And just like that, the dam broke. Marguerite found herself talking about her father, how Lord Edmund Harris had spent evenings debating philosophy with her instead of teaching her watercolors, how he'd encouraged her to think rather than simply absorb. "He died 3 years ago," she heard herself say, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "A riding accident. Sudden. He was my champion, Your Grace. The only person who believed my mind was a gift rather than a curse." Humberto stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I'm sorry. That kind of loss, when someone truly sees you, it leaves a particular emptiness." Something in his tone made her bold. "You sound as though you understand. Being a duke means everyone wants something from you," he said quietly, his storm-grey eyes distant. "Your influence, your wealth, your connections. But no one simply wants you. The person beneath the title." He gave a harsh laugh. "I've been lonely in rooms full of people my entire adult life." Marguerite's breath caught. Beneath his aristocratic mask, she saw the same isolation she'd carried for years, the burden of being valued for the wrong reasons, or not valued at all. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "we're not so different. Your Grace. Perhaps not, Miss Harris." His gaze held hers for a heartbeat too long. Perhaps not at all. Dinner that evening became theatre. The Harris family had assembled in full, Lady Victoria presiding with nervous energy, Celeste resplendent in blue silk, cousins Penelope and Arabella positioned to maximum advantage. The seating chart had obviously placed Humberto between Celeste and Lady Victoria. He ignored it entirely. "Miss Harris," he said, appearing at Marguerite's side before anyone could protest. "I believe we were discussing Kant's categorical imperative yesterday. I'm eager to hear your thoughts on moral absolutism." He pulled out the chair beside hers, his intention unmistakable. The table fell silent. Marguerite could feel her mother's bewilderment, Celeste's fury, her cousin's shock radiating like heat. "I find Kant's framework compelling but incomplete," Marguerite managed, aware of every eye upon her. "He fails to account for cultural relativism. But surely objective moral law must exist independent of cultural context," Humberto countered, settling beside her with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Otherwise we descend into ethical chaos," and they were off, debating Enlightenment philosophy over roasted pheasant and wine, their voices the only sound in the stunned dining room. Marguerite forgot to be self-conscious, forgot everything except the exhilaration of intellectual combat with someone who could match her thought for thought. When she glanced up, she found Celeste staring at her with naked envy, Penelope and Arabella whispering urgently behind their fans, and her mother watching with an expression caught between confusion and cautious hope. "The Duke seems quite taken with you, dear," Lady Victoria ventured after dinner, her voice carefully neutral. Marguerite could only nod, her heart still racing from more than just debate. "You play, don't you?" Humberto appeared in the music room doorway that evening, where Marguerite had sought refuge. "I've been told you have considerable talent." "I don't perform." The old shame rose swift and familiar. "I'm not asking you to perform. I'm asking you to play." He crossed to the pianoforte, opened the lid with reverent care. "For me, not for society, not for judgment, just play." So she did. Her fingers found Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, the notes spilling out like confession, like prayer. She'd always loved this piece, its melancholy beauty, its quiet passion. Humberto moved to stand beside the instrument, and when she reached the page turn, his hand was there, turning the sheet with perfect timing. Their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, accidental, electric. Marguerite's hands faltered on the keys. When she looked up, Humberto was staring at her with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. For one suspended moment, the air between them crackled with something that had nothing to do with intellectual compatibility. Then he stepped back abruptly, his expression shuddering. "Remember our agreement, Miss Harris." His voice was rough. No complications, but his eyes betrayed him completely. Long after he'd retreated to the guest wing, Marguerite sat at her writing desk, journal open, pen trembling in her hand. "Day 1 of our arrangement," she wrote, "and I'm already breaking his tenet. When he spoke of loneliness, I saw myself reflected in his eyes. When he defended my right to think, I felt seen in a way I haven't since father died. And when our hands touched, she stopped, unable to put into words the electricity of that brief contact. No one simply wants you, he'd said. But wasn't that exactly what was happening? Not to the Duke of Thornwick, not to M.R. Harrington, the anonymous essayist, but to two desperately lonely people who'd finally found someone who understood. She fell asleep thinking of storm-grey eyes and the impossible promise she'd already broken. In the guest wing, Humberto stood by the window, Marguerite's latest published essay in his hands, the one on individual liberty he'd carried with him from London. He traced her words with one finger, his reflection ghost-like in the darkened glass. "What am I doing?" he whispered to the empty room. The paper rustled in his grip, and he knew with terrible certainty the tenet he'd imposed was already shattered, had been from the moment she'd challenged him in the rose garden, her brilliant mind laid bare without apology. He'd promised emotional distance. Instead, he was falling, and they had 13 days left. 5 days into their arrangement, and Everwood had transformed into something both wonderful and terrifying. Marguerite and Humberto had fallen into a rhythm as natural as breathing dawn walks through frost-covered gardens, afternoon tea in the library, where they debated everything from Aristotelian ethics to agricultural reform, evening discussions that stretched long past propriety. The servants whispered. Marguerite caught the housekeeper smiling knowingly, heard the maids giggling about the Duke's intentions. Her mother watched with cautious optimism that made Marguerite's chest ache with guilt. Even her uncle, who'd extended the Christmas invitation, nodded approvingly whenever he saw them together. Only Celeste seemed immune to the spell. Her sister's eyes followed them with something darker than jealousy calculation, mixed with barely concealed fury. But Marguerite pushed those concerns aside when she was with Humberto. In his presence, the rest of the world simply faded. "We need to practice dancing," Humberto announced on the 6th morning, appearing in the library where Marguerite had been transcribing notes. "We must appear natural together at the ball. I can waltz adequately, Your Grace." "Adequately isn't sufficient." He extended his hand. "Come, the ballroom should be empty at this hour." The Everwood ballroom was a cathedral of light and space, tall windows flooding the parquet floor with winter sunshine. Without music, without witnesses, the vast space felt intimate rather than grand. "May I?" Humberto's hand settled at her waist, warm through the fabric of her morning dress. His other hand clasped hers, and suddenly Marguerite couldn't remember how to breathe. "The waltz is about trust," he said quietly, beginning to move. "You must let me lead." They swept across the floor in silence, and Marguerite discovered that dancing with Humberto was like their intellectual debates made physical, a give and take, a conversation without words. His hand at her waist guided her through turns, his body telegraphing intention before movement. They moved in perfect synchronization, as if they'd been dancing together for years rather than moments. She was so lost in the rhythm that she didn't see the raised seam in the parquet. Her foot caught, her balance faltered. Humberto's arm tightened, pulling her against him, steadying her. Suddenly they were motionless in the center of the ballroom, her hands pressed against his chest, his arm iron-strong around her waist. Their faces were inches apart. She could see the darker flecks in his storm-grey eyes, could feel his heart thundering beneath her palm. "Marguerite," he breathed, and her name on his lips was somehow both question and answer. Then he released her so abruptly she nearly stumbled again. "Again," he said, his voice rough. "We must be perfect." But his hands trembled as he resumed the dance position. That afternoon, Marguerite entered the library to find Humberto at her father's desk, her latest unpublished manuscript spread before him, his pen flying across the margins. "How did you—" She crossed the room in 3 swift strides. "That's private. Your maid thought I was collecting books for you." He didn't look up, still writing. "This argument about educational reform is brilliant, but your conclusion is flawed. You're conflating access with quality." "I am not conflating." She leaned over his shoulder to see what he'd written. "You can't possibly think that maintaining exclusivity ensures quality. That's elitist nonsense. And you can't possibly believe that universal access without standards ensures anything beyond mediocrity." They argued for 20 minutes, leaning over the desk, their voices rising with passion, occasionally jabbing at passages in her manuscript to prove their points. The debate grew heated, almost physical in its intensity, not with anger, but with the pure exhilaration of intellectual combat between equals. Finally, breathless, Marguerite straightened. "You're insufferable. You're magnificent." The words escaped before he could stop them. Humberto stood, moving around the desk to face her fully. "You're the only person who challenges me, Marguerite. The only one who sees past the title to the man beneath. Do you know how rare that is? Her name." He'd used her Christian name without the formal address, and hearing it in his low voice made something flutter dangerously in her chest. "Humberto," she said, testing his name on her tongue, watching his eyes darken at the sound. They both froze, realizing simultaneously what had just transpired. The careful distance they'd maintained, the formal addresses that had kept them safely separate, all of it crumbling. "We should—" Humberto stepped back. "Miss Harris, I apologize." "Don't." The word came out sharper than intended. "Don't apologize, and don't retreat into formality. We've gone past that, and we both know it." The silence stretched between them, acknowledgement of dangerous territory, of boundaries crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. "You're making a fool of yourself." Celeste appeared in Marguerite's doorway that evening, her beautiful face twisted with something ugly. "Do not develop foolish notions, sister. A duke would never truly want someone like you." "Celeste, that's enough." "Is it? You think I don't see what's happening?" Her sister laughed, the sound brittle. "This is obviously some game or wager. Perhaps his friends bet he couldn't make the blue-stocking spinster fall in love with him. Perhaps he's simply bored and your convenient entertainment before he returns to London and forgets you exist." The words struck like physical blows, finding every insecurity Marguerite had been trying to ignore. "You'll attend the ball on his arm, and then he'll leave," Celeste continued mercilessly. "And you'll be exactly what you've always been, unmarriageable, unloved, and alone." Long after her sister departed, Marguerite lay awake in the darkness, Celeste's warnings echoing in her mind. What if this was all performance? What if she was deluding herself, seeing romance where there was only temporary arrangement? His one tenet haunted her: don't fall in love. Tomorrow, she decided, she would guard her heart more carefully. Tomorrow she would reinforce the boundaries that had somehow dissolved over 6 impossible days. Tomorrow she would remember that dukes didn't fall in love with blue-stocking spinsters. But tonight, alone in the dark, she let herself remember the feel of his arms around her, the way he'd whispered her name, the truth that terrified her most. It was already far too late for caution. She'd broken his tenet days ago. The morning after Celeste's warning dawned grey and cold, matching Marguerite's resolve. When Humberto appeared at the garden gate for their customary walk, she met him with renewed formality, her spine straight, her manner deliberately distant. "Good morning, Your Grace." The title felt like armor, protection against the dangerous intimacy they'd been building. Something flickered across his face, hurt, perhaps, or confusion. "Miss Harris." His tone matched hers, cool and correct. "Shall we?" They walked in painful silence, the easy conversation of previous days replaced by stilted observations about weather and landscape. When he asked about her latest essay, she provided perfunctory answers. When he tried to engage her in debate, she deflected. By the second day of this cold distance, the entire household noticed. "Have the Duke and Miss Marguerite quarrelled?" she heard a maid whisper. "Must have," another replied. "He looks like a thundercloud, and she's been hiding in the library." Lady Victoria fretted openly at dinner. "Perhaps I should speak with Marguerite. Whatever disagreement they've had—" "Leave it, Mother," Celeste interjected, her satisfaction poorly concealed. "Some things simply aren't meant to be." Marguerite kept her eyes on her plate, feeling Humberto's gaze burning across the table, but she didn't look up, couldn't look up, because if she did, if she saw the questions in those storm-grey eyes, her resolve would shatter. On the 8th day, a carriage arrived from London bearing Humberto's secretary, a thin, efficient man named Mr. Pemberton, who carried leather portfolios and an air of urgent business. Marguerite watched from her window as they disappeared into her uncle's study, grateful for the reprieve from Humberto's wounded, questioning glances. She spent the day in the library, trying to lose herself in Locke's treatises, but the words blurred on the page. Late afternoon found her restless, desperate for distraction. She'd left a volume of Voltaire in the study that morning. Perhaps retrieving it would give her hands something to do besides trembling. The study door stood partially ajar. Marguerite reached for the handle, then froze as voices drifted through the opening. "You're certain about the Harris girls' publications?" Mr. Pemberton's crisp tones. "Absolutely." Humberto's voice, warm in a way she hadn't heard in 2 days. I've been reading M.R. Harrington's essays for 2 years. She's brilliant, genuinely, extraordinarily brilliant. Marguerite's hand stilled on the doorframe, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. And when you discovered she was the woman society dismissed as unmarriageable, the secretary pressed. A pause. Then, I knew I had to meet her. I arranged the invitation to Everwood specifically for that purpose. The world tilted. Marguerite pressed her hand against the wall for balance, barely breathing. So, the fake engagement, Mr. Pemberton's tone held knowing amusement, was the only way I could think to spend time with her without frightening her away. Humberto's voice dropped, rough with emotion. She's been hurt by society's rejection, Pemberton, dismissed and mocked for the very qualities that make her extraordinary. She'd never have believed my interest was genuine if I'd simply called and declared myself. Silence. Then, quieter. Though I'm not certain this plan will work. She guards her heart as fiercely as I guard mine. And if she discovers the truth, the secretary asked, that you orchestrated this entire arrangement, then I'll have lost the only woman I've ever wanted to truly know. Marguerite fled. She didn't remember climbing the stairs, didn't remember reaching her bedroom, was only aware of her heart thundering against her ribs as she pressed her back against the closed door. The entire arrangement, the proposition, the tenet, all of it had been an elaborate courtship disguised as practicality. He'd fallen in love with her mind, through her essays, had sought her out deliberately, had created a scenario where they could spend time together without her suspecting his true intentions. She'd never have believed my interest was genuine. He was right. She wouldn't have. She would have assumed mockery or pity or some elaborate joke at her expense. And the one tenet, don't fall in love, that hadn't been to protect her from foolishness. It had been to protect his own vulnerable heart while he waited to see if she might come to care for him in return. Marguerite sank onto her bed, hands shaking. She'd been in love with him since their first debate in the rose garden, since he'd called her magnificent without apology, since he'd seen her as she truly was and found her worthy of his formidable intellect. They'd both been lying. To society, yes, but more crucially to each other, playing roles when the truth had been simple all along. Two lonely people who'd finally found their match. 3 days until the Ashford ball. 3 days until their arrangement officially ended, and they were supposed to part ways with their dignity and freedom intact. She could confront him now, reveal what she'd overheard, lay bare the deceptions on both sides. Or she could honor their agreement, attend the ball as planned, and then what? Walk away from the only person who'd ever truly understood her, pretend she hadn't fallen catastrophically in love with a man who'd been in love with her mind for 2 years before they'd even met. Marguerite stood, moved to her writing desk, pulled out her journal with trembling hands. 3 more days, she wrote. I'll honor our agreement through the ball. But afterwards, I'll tell him everything that I know, his secret, that I've broken his tenet, that I've been his from the moment he defended me in the rose garden. Can I survive 3 more days without revealing my heart? I suppose we'll discover the limits of my courage. She closed the journal and pressed her palm against its leather cover, as if trying to contain the truth that wanted to spill out. 3 more days of pretense. Then everything would change. If her courage held, 2 days before the Ashford ball, and Marguerite was drowning. Knowledge of Humberto's true intentions had transformed everything. Every glance carried hidden meaning. Every word felt weighted with unspoken truth. She tried to act normal during their morning walk, but her awareness of his deception made her clumsy, self-conscious. You're distracted this morning, Humberto observed, his tone carefully neutral. Is something troubling you? Everything, she wanted to say. I know why you're really here. I know you've loved me since before we met. I know your tenet was a lie. Instead, she said, simply preoccupied with the upcoming ball, Your Grace. Something flickered across his face, disappointment, perhaps frustration. Their conversation limped along, lacking the spark that had made previous days electric. By afternoon tea, the strain between them was palpable. Have I offended you somehow? He asked abruptly, setting down his cup with more force than necessary. These past days, you've been what? Absent. Even when you're sitting right here. His storm-grey eyes searched her face. If I've done something, you've done nothing wrong, Your Grace. The lie tasted bitter. Perhaps we're both simply tired of pretense. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. That evening, Marguerite sought refuge in the conservatory, hiding among winter-dormant plants and the ghost scent of summer flowers. The glass walls showed her reflection, pale, strained, miserable. One more day of this charade, then she could confess everything. One more day of, "You've been avoiding me." She spun to find Humberto in the doorway, his expression thunderous. He closed the distance between them in 3 swift strides. "I'm merely maintaining appropriate distance, Your Grace," she managed, retreating until her back hit the glass wall. "Don't," the word was almost a growl, "don't retreat into formality with me. Not after everything." He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "What changed, Marguerite? We were, and then suddenly you were made of ice. You established the rules," she shot back, something breaking inside her. "You demanded distance, no feelings, no sentiment. I'm simply honoring our agreement." "To hell with our agreement." The words exploded from him. "Do you know what torture this has been? Spending every day with the one person who truly sees me, knowing it must end. Knowing that in 3 days you'll walk out of my life and I'll go back to being—" He stopped, breathing hard. "You're the one who made the rule," Marguerite's voice broke. "You demanded no feelings, no complications. Don't blame me for following your conditions." "Yes, because I'm a coward." The admission seemed to shock them both into silence. Humberto's chest heaved, his hands clenched at his sides. "Because I knew that if I let myself feel, if I let myself want—" He stopped himself, shaking his head violently. "2 more days, then we're free of this arrangement." But his voice broke on "free," and Marguerite saw the truth written plainly in his face. He didn't want freedom. He wanted her. Before she could speak, he turned and left, the conservatory door swinging shut behind him with damning finality. Marguerite collapsed onto a stone bench, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't do this, couldn't wait another day, another hour. Tomorrow morning, she would tell him everything that she'd overheard his conversation with Mr. Pemberton, that she knew his proposition had been elaborate courtship, that she'd broken his tenet the moment it was spoken. Tomorrow. No more lies, no more pretense. She fell asleep with that resolution firm in her heart. Celeste had watched the conservatory scene from the shadows of the corridor, her beautiful face twisted with satisfaction. She'd suspected real feeling between them, and now she'd confirmed it. Well, she couldn't allow her blue-stocking sister to capture a duke through mere intellectual conversation. In her chamber, she penned a note in careful, disguised handwriting. "Your Grace, you should know that Miss Harris has been laughing about your gullibility to the servants. She finds your infatuation amusing and plans to humiliate you at the ball. You are her entertainment, nothing more. A concerned friend." She slipped it under Humberto's door just after midnight, then returned to her room with a smile. Humberto found the note when he returned from a restless walk through the grounds. He read it once, twice, his blood turning to ice. His worst fear, laid out in anonymous script. She'd been using him, his proposition, his carefully orchestrated courtship, his vulnerability in the conservatory, all of it entertainment for a woman who found his feelings amusing. He crumpled the note in his fist, jaw tight with humiliation and fury. Morning came grey and bitter. Marguerite descended the stairs with her confession rehearsed, her heart fortified with courage. She found Humberto in the breakfast room, his expression carved from marble. "Your Grace, I need to speak with you. Perhaps we should cancel our arrangement." His voice was cold, utterly devoid of yesterday's passion. "I'll make an excuse to your family. A business emergency in London." Marguerite felt the world tilt. What? This charade has become tiresome, for both of us, I suspect." He wouldn't meet her eyes. Better to end it now than continue this. Entertainment. The word struck like a physical blow. Entertainment. The same word Celeste had used. "If that's what you wish, Your Grace." Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "It is." She turned and walked from the room, her confession dying unspoken, her heart shattering with each step. Behind her, Humberto gripped the table edge until his knuckles turned white, the crumpled note burning in his pocket. One day until the Ashford ball. The engagement, fake or otherwise, was over. Neither knew the other's true feelings. Neither knew about Celeste's interference. And Celeste, watching from the doorway, smiled. Marguerite woke on the morning of the Ashford ball with a clarity that felt like armor. No more pride, no more fear, no more silence. She would find Humberto and tell him everything, consequences be damned. She found him in the library, surrounded by half-packed books, his traveling case open on her father's desk. The sight struck her like a physical blow. "You're departing?" He turned, his face carefully blank. "There's no reason to stay if our arrangement is concluded." "What if I told you," she said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her, "that I overheard your conversation with Mr. Pemberton?" Humberto went utterly still. "What?" "8 days ago, in the study." Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. "You've been reading M.R. Harrington's essays for 2 years. You arranged the invitation to Everwood specifically to meet me. The entire proposition, the fake engagement, the tenet, all of it was an elaborate courtship." The color drained from his face. "Marguerite, you said I'd never have believed your interest was genuine, that I'd been hurt too badly by society's rejection." She moved closer, watching emotions cascade across his features: shock, shame, fear. "You called yourself a coward for making the rule about not falling in love." "Yes," the word came out raw. "Yes, I've been deceiving you, from the beginning." He turned away, gripping the desk edge. "I read your essays and fell in love with your mind, the brilliance, the courage of your arguments, the way you challenged conventional wisdom without apology. When I discovered that M.R. Harrington was actually the woman society had dismissed as unmarriageable, I knew I had to meet you." He laughed harshly. "But how could I approach you? What was I supposed to say? I've been reading your secret writings for years, and I'm in love with your intellect. You would have thought me mad or mocking. So you created a scenario," Marguerite said softly, "where we could spend time together, where I might come to trust you, where you might come to see me as I saw you." He finally turned to face her, his storm-gray eyes blazing with emotion. "I'm not sorry for that. I'm not sorry for wanting to know you, to understand you, to discover if the woman behind those extraordinary words was as remarkable as I suspected." He took a shuddering breath. "But I am sorry for the tenet, for making you think I wanted distance when every moment with you was torture because I wanted so much more. You're apologizing for the wrong thing." Marguerite closed the distance between them until only inches separated them. "Your one tenet was impossible to honor from the very first day. I broke it the moment you called me magnificent in the rose garden." Humberto stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've been in love with you since our first debate, since you saw past the mockery and dismissal to the person I actually am." Her voice broke. "I've been terrified you'd discover my feelings and pity me, that this was all just an elaborate game. This note," he pulled the crumpled paper from his pocket with shaking hands, "this damned note that said you'd been laughing about me to the servants, that you planned to humiliate me at the ball." Marguerite snatched it, read it, and felt fury ignite in her chest. "Celeste, this is my sister's handwriting, disguised." She looked up, understanding dawning. "She's been sabotaging us. But why? Because she's jealous. Because she can't bear that the blue-stocking spinster might actually capture a duke's heart." Marguerite crumpled the note in her fist. "We've been protecting our hearts while hurting each other, both of us too afraid to speak the truth. Then let me speak it now." Humberto cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent. "I'm done with rules and pretense. I love you, Marguerite, truly, completely, devastatingly. I love your brilliant mind and your fierce courage and the way you argue with me as an equal. I love how you see past my title to the lonely man beneath. I love God help me. I love everything about you. And I love you." The words felt like liberation. "Your hidden kindness, your formidable intellect, the way you've made me feel seen for the first time in my life. I love you, Humberto. Not the Duke of Thornwick, but you." He kissed her. Not the careful, restrained kiss of propriety, but something claiming and passionate and full of weeks of suppressed longing. Marguerite melted into him, her hands fisting in his coat, her entire world narrowing to the taste of his lips, the warmth of his embrace, the rightness of being held by him. The library door opened. A maid gasped. Footsteps retreated rapidly. They broke apart, both breathing hard, and Marguerite started to laugh. "Scandal. I don't care." Humberto pressed his forehead to hers. "Let them talk. Let the whole world know." "The ball is tonight," Marguerite said. "We should still attend. Not as fake fiancés." His eyes blazed with determination. "I'll court you properly before all society. I'll announce my genuine intentions, make our love undeniably real. They'll be shocked." "Good." He kissed her again, briefly, fiercely. Let them be shocked. The blue-stocking and the Duke, choosing each other openly and defiantly. Hours later, as Marguerite prepared for the ball in her chamber, her hands trembled with nervous energy. Tonight, everything would change. Tonight, they would stand before society not as a convenient arrangement, but as two people who'd found love in the most unexpected way. In his guest chamber, Humberto adjusted his cravat with shaking fingers. Tonight, he would claim her publicly. Tonight, the pretense would end and the truth would begin. Tonight, the blue stocking and the Duke would shock polite society, and neither of them could wait. The Ashford estate blazed with Christmas splendor, 1,000 candles reflecting off crystal chandeliers, evergreen garlands dripping with gold ribbon, the air thick with pine and beeswax and anticipation. Carriages lined the drive, disgorging London's elite in their finest silks and jewels, all eager to witness what society had been whispering about for weeks, the impossible courtship between the Duke of Thornwick and the unmarriageable blue stocking. Marguerite arrived with her family, her heart thundering beneath the emerald silk gown that had arrived that afternoon. Humberto's gift, the color of her eyes, cut in the latest fashion to emphasize her height rather than apologize for it. The accompanying note had been brief. "Wear this tonight. Let them see you as I do." "You look beautiful, dear," Lady Victoria whispered, though her voice trembled with anxiety. Beside them, Celeste seethed in pink silk, her beauty somehow diminished by the fury in her eyes. She'd said nothing since the library scandal had spread through the household like wildfire. The ballroom fell silent as they entered. Marguerite felt hundreds of eyes upon her, assessing, judging, whispering behind fans. Is it real? Can it possibly be real? Then Humberto arrived. He appeared in the doorway like a storm given human form, dark evening coat, emphasizing his broad shoulders, cravat crisp white against his throat, storm-grey eyes searching the crowd with single-minded intensity. When his gaze found Marguerite, his expression transformed into something so raw, so utterly unguarded, that nearby gossips fell silent mid-whisper. He crossed directly to her, ignoring protocol, ignoring the shocked faces of matrons who'd been angling for his attention. He bowed before Marguerite, took her hand, and pressed a kiss to her gloved knuckles that lingered just past propriety. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice carrying in the hushed ballroom, "you are luminous." Before anyone else could approach, before social convention could intervene, he added, "I believe you promised me the first waltz." "I believe I did, Your Grace." Her smile felt like sunrise. They took the floor as the orchestra struck the opening notes. All eyes watched, some curious, some scandalized, some envious. But Marguerite was aware only of Humberto's hand at her waist, his other hand clasping hers, the way they moved together as if they'd been dancing for years rather than weeks. "I don't care who's watching," he murmured as they swept past the gawking crowd. "You're mine, Marguerite, and you're mine, Humberto." She smiled up at him, radiant with defiance and joy. Let them talk. The waltz ended to scattered applause, but before the next dance could begin, Humberto gestured to the orchestra. The conductor, looking bewildered, silenced his musicians. "Ladies and gentlemen," Humberto's voice rang clear across the ballroom, "if I might have your attention." The crowd pressed closer, hungry for scandal or romance or both. "I came to this ball intending to announce a false engagement." Gasps rippled through the assembly. Marguerite's heart stopped. A practical arrangement to satisfy society's demands and silence malicious gossip. The whispers grew louder. Lady Victoria looked faint. Celeste's face lit with vindictive triumph. "But I cannot perpetuate that lie." Humberto's gaze found Marguerite's, held it. "The truth is far more extraordinary." He turned back to the crowd, his voice carrying authority and passion in equal measure. "Miss Marguerite Harris is the finest mind I've encountered in my 31 years. She's published essays under the name M.R. Harrington that have influenced political discourse across England." More gasps. "She speaks 3 languages, debates philosophy with the skill of an Oxford don, and possesses more courage in her smallest finger than I have in my entire body." His voice hardened. "Society dismissed her as unmarriageable because she threatened your comfortable assumptions about women's capabilities. But her brilliance, her refusal to apologize for her intellect, those are precisely the qualities that captured my interest and my heart." He turned to Marguerite directly, crossing the space between them, taking both her hands in his. "I don't want a fake engagement, Marguerite. I want a real marriage." He dropped to one knee before her, before all of London society. "Marguerite R. Harris, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not because society demands it, not because it's convenient, but because I am hopelessly, irrevocably in love with you. He produced a ring sapphire surrounded by diamonds, catching candlelight like captured stars. This was my grandmother's. She was, like you, too intelligent for her era. My grandfather loved her desperately for it. Marguerite's vision blurred with tears, but her voice was steady. Yes. 1,000 times yes. The ballroom erupted, some in applause, some in shocked whispers, some in scandalized exclamations. Humberto slid the ring onto her finger, rose, and kissed her thoroughly, possessively, in front of everyone. Lady Victoria wept openly. Penelope and Arabella stood frozen, forced to witness their mockery transformed into triumph, and Celeste looked like she'd swallowed poison. Baron Pembridge approached, his condescension barely concealed. "Your Grace, Miss Harris, may I offer congratulations?" "My fiancé," Humberto said coldly, positioning himself slightly in front of Marguerite, "requires no validation from you, Pembridge." His storm-grey eyes were arctic. In fact, her intellectual superiority was the very trait that captured my interest. Perhaps if you'd possessed similar discernment last year, you wouldn't have made such a spectacular fool of yourself. The Baron retreated, crimson-faced, while nearby guests struggled to hide their smiles. As midnight approached, Humberto drew Marguerite away from the spectacle, out into the garden where snow had begun to fall in soft, silent flakes. They stood beneath a pergola draped with winter roses, alone at last. "Are you certain you want this?" His hands cupped her face tenderly. The scrutiny, the expectations of being a duchess, society's judgment. "I'm certain I want you." Marguerite covered his hands with hers. "The rest we'll figure out together." He kissed her as snow fell around them, as music drifted from the ballroom, as their old lives ended and their new life began. Two lonely people who'd found each other, two brilliant minds who'd recognized their match, and society could whisper all it wanted. Spring had transformed Thornwick Castle into something from a fairy tale. The gardens burst with roses and lavender, apple blossoms drifted on warm breezes, and sunlight painted the ancient stone walls in shades of honey and gold. Inside the library, Marguerite's redesigned sanctuary, now twice its original size, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, the Duchess of Thornwick sat at her writing desk, one hand absently resting on her visibly pregnant belly. "Mama, look." 2-year-old Alexander held up a precarious tower of wooden blocks, his storm-grey eyes so like his father's, bright with pride. "Magnificent architecture, darling," Marguerite said warmly, just as the tower collapsed in a spectacular crash that sent the boy into peals of laughter. "He has your disregard for conventional structural design," Humberto observed from the doorway, holding a sheaf of papers. He crossed to kiss his wife's temple before settling the documents before her. "Your latest essay is creating quite the stir in Parliament. Lord Melbourne himself sent word that your arguments on education reform are troublingly persuasive." Marguerite smiled. 3 years of marriage, and she still published now under her real name, Marguerite Harris Hinton, with no apology and considerable influence. Her work on social reform had shaped actual legislation. The blue-stocking spinster had become one of England's most respected public intellectuals. "Do you ever think about that Christmas?" she asked, watching Alexander attempt to rebuild his tower. "The fake engagement, how terrified we both were." Humberto laughed, pulling her up into his arms despite her protesting belly. "The worst plan I ever conceived and the best thing I ever did. We were both so terrified of being hurt, we nearly destroyed our chance at happiness." "Your one tenet," Marguerite teased. "Don't fall in love, Miss Harris. How did that work out for you?" "Spectacularly poorly." He kissed her soundly. "Thank God." Lady Victoria arrived for tea with Celeste, who had transformed remarkably over 3 years. Marguerite's sister had married a kind country gentleman who valued her softer nature, and motherhood had gentled her sharp edges. The reconciliation between the sisters had been gradual but genuine. "I'm sorry," Celeste had said, months after the Ashford ball, tears streaming. "For everything. The mockery, the sabotage, all of it. I was frightened and jealous and cruel." Now they sat together in comfortable companionship, Celeste admiring the library, while Lady Victoria cooed over Alexander. "Your book has become required reading at Cambridge," Lady Victoria said with barely concealed pride. "My daughter, influencing young minds. Who would have imagined?" "You should have," Marguerite thought, but didn't say. "You should have imagined it all along." But she merely smiled and poured more tea. Oxford has invited you to lecture, Celeste said. Will you accept? It would be terribly scandalous. I've already accepted, Marguerite replied. Let them be scandalized. Humberto has promised to sit in the front row and glare at anyone who objects. Damn right I will, her husband confirmed from across the room, making Lady Victoria gasp at his language and Celeste laugh. Evening found them alone again. Alexander asleep upstairs, the library lit by firelight and spring twilight. Humberto pulled Marguerite onto his lap carefully, mindful of her pregnancy, and studied her face with the same intensity he'd shown that first day in the rose garden. I've been thinking about my infamous one tenet, he said. Don't fall in love. Marguerite traced his jawline with gentle fingers. Rather spectacular failure, that. The most magnificent failure of my life. He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. I thought protecting my heart was strength, but opening it to you, that was true courage. Society told us we were wrong for each other, Marguerite said softly. Too intellectual, too proud, too unconventional. But the only opinion that ever mattered was ours. Speaking of opinions, Humberto's hand settled over her belly, feeling their daughter move beneath his palm. Have you decided on a name? Catherine, Marguerite said. After your mother, and we'll raise her with the same intellectual freedom I fought for. She'll never question whether she deserves to be heard. Humberto's eyes gleamed with emotion. You're extraordinary, you know that? You've mentioned it once or twice. He shifted, kneeling before her chair, his hand still on her pregnant belly. 3 years ago, I asked you to act as my fiancée, a temporary arrangement to solve our problems. And instead you got a wife who argues with you, publishes controversial essays, and scandalizes society, Marguerite said. Tonight I ask you to continue being my wife, my partner, my greatest intellectual sparring partner. His voice roughened with emotion, not because society demands it, but because I love you more with each passing day. Because you challenge me, inspire me, see me as no one else ever has. That's the easiest question you've ever asked me, Your Grace. Marguerite cupped his face, her thumb brushing his cheekbone. Yes, today, tomorrow, always yes. They kissed as spring rain began pattering against the windows, soft and promising. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a lie, a pretense that forces two people to spend time together until the truth becomes undeniable. Marguerite and Humberto learned that the rules we create to protect our hearts often become the very barriers to our happiness. They learned that society's judgments are meaningless when you've found someone who sees your true worth. And they learned that the bravest thing you can do is not guard your heart, but offer it freely to someone worthy of holding it. 6 months later, baby Catherine arrived during a thunderstorm, howling her displeasure at the world with the same fierce spirit her mother possessed. The family portrait painted that autumn showed the Duke and Duchess of Thornwick, with their children Alexander building imaginary towers, infant Catherine sleeping peacefully, and Marguerite and Humberto looking not at the painter, but at each other. The inscription read simply, The Duke and Duchess of Thornwick, 1818, and they lived not perfectly, but authentically, which is far better. Dear listener, if this tale of courage, intellect, and love defying convention has touched your heart, I would be honored by your support. Share this story with someone who needs reminding that their mind is a gift, not a curse. That being too much for some means you're exactly right for the one who matters. Until our next story, remember, the right person will love you not despite your brilliance, but because of it.